Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Opioids and Death Investigation, The Perfect Storm. This is our sixth webinar in our webinar Opioid Crisis series. Rates of opioid use and misuse have reached epidemic proportions and are impacting many aspects of both criminal justice and forensic science programs. Opioid addiction is the driving force behind this increase in use, with nearly 3 million Americans reporting a substance use disorder to prescription pain relievers or heroin in 2015, fueling a steady increase in fatalities to an estimated 91 U.S. deaths daily. These rates are not slowing, rather they are doubling, quadrupling, or undergoing even more alarming increases in some areas. Law enforcement, medical professionals, laboratories, and legal agencies are battling with unmanageable caseloads, economic shortfalls, and challenges for safety, analytical preparedness, and basic education and training. Reliable surveillance and intelligence are needed more than they have ever been. Confronted with the fast-paced emerging drug life cycles, the legislative quagmire is just as burdensome, as policy change cannot happen without the data to support change. This webinar series will bring a multifaceted perspective to how diverse criminal justice disciplines are addressing these challenges, sharing their knowledge, and advancing science, technology, and law. Dealing with the impacts of the opioid crisis to the criminal justice system requires better reporting, surveillance, research, technology, and policy than are currently in use. The need to understand the epidemic and its effects goes beyond knowing your own profession. It takes a global perspective to fully act and make a difference. My name is Josh Vickers. I'm with RTI International and the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I will be your host for today's webinar. Again, today's webinar is entitled Opioids and Death Investigation, The Perfect Storm. One second. All right, today's presenter is Dr. Andrew Baker. Dr. Andrew Baker is a graduate of the University of Iowa. He completed his pathology residency at the University of Iowa and a forensic pathology fellowship in Minneapolis. He is board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology. He is a fellow of the College of American Pathologists, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and the National Association of Medical Examiners. Prior to practicing as a forensic pathologist with the Hennepin County Medical Examiner in Minneapolis, Dr. Baker served 4 years as a medical examiner in the U.S. Air Force. He was appointed to the position of Chief Medical Examiner for Hennepin County in 2004 and was reappointed in 2008, 2012, and 2016. Our disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and switch everyone to Dr. Baker's presentation, and we're going to hand things over to our presenter, Dr. Andrew Baker.
Thank you very much, Josh. Greetings, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today to give you the medical examiner perspective on opioids and death investigation. I want to start with a couple of disclosures. I have no financial or other conflicts to disclose. I am going to talk about medical examiners versus coroners, but not in any sort of competitive context today. I just want to help frame how we investigate deaths in America to help you understand why it varies so wildly from one jurisdiction to another. There will be some graphic images of human remains in this presentation, nothing terribly horrible, but we do want to talk about some of the autopsy findings in opioid fatalities. I want to mention that any opinions I express are mine alone, and pretty much everything I say during this talk is going to sound pessimistic because I don't really have any good news. I should also add that I did not obviously coin the phrase a perfect storm, nor am I even the first medical examiner to use it. I will offer the appropriate attribution when the time comes, but for now, it is a spot-on metaphor. So what I want to talk about in the next 45 or 50 minutes is the scope of the opioid epidemic in America, switch gears a little bit and talk about how we investigate deaths in America and what are the current challenges to our death investigation system, and then we'll loop back to the question, where do opioid deaths fit into all of this? I want to address how we as medical examiners and coroners investigate apparent opioid-related fatalities, and then offer a couple of concluding thoughts, and I look forward to your questions. So it can't come as a surprise to anyone on this call, or probably anyone in America, that we are in the middle of a crisis of opioid-related deaths. Much of this is due to the skyrocketing number of heroin deaths in recent years, and as we'll see later in this presentation, deaths from fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. If you view our skyrocketing opiate deaths another way, you can see that nearly all of the increase in the last 5 years has been due to heroin and fentanyl. If you're tempted to think that the word epidemic is a bit hyperbolic, consider that the number of all drug-related deaths in the United States, which is going to top out between 59 and 65,000 in 2016, now exceeds other public health scourges, such as car crashes in 1972, HIV deaths at the peak of the AIDS epidemic in 1995, and gun-related deaths in 1993. In 2015, total drug deaths in America exceeded car crashes and gun deaths, and dwarfed the number of HIV deaths at the peak of HIV in 1995. It was actually in 2007 when drug deaths exceeded motor vehicle fatalities, and they have done so ever since. No other country comes close to the United States in drug-related fatalities, and it can't be a coincidence that Americans consume more opioids than citizens of any other country. With the skyrocketing number of fentanyl deaths now added to our burden of drug overdoses have become the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50. In 2016, roughly 2% of deaths, 1 in 50 in the United States, were drug-related. And we may be undercounting the contribution of opiates. In some states, barely 50% of drug overdose death certificates actually list the drugs. Other states are clearly doing a much better job. In 2016, 17% of quote-unquote drug overdose death certificates in the United States did not specify what the drugs were. There is not a segment of society left untouched by the opioid epidemic. This op-ed is from a state legislator who came to understand her state's opioid crisis after a trip to the medical examiner's office. In some cities, librarians have been forced to recognize and treat drug overdoses. Harkening back to lessons learned from the AIDS epidemic, playwrights in Ohio, which is arguably ground zero for the opioid crisis, are now using theater to portray opiate addiction. No one is immune to the opioid crisis, not even the families of medical examiners. When funeral directors, who are generally known for their quiet stoicism rather than their colorful languages, post blogs like this on their own funeral homes' websites, you know you have a crisis. To be sure, the crisis has hit some parts of the United States far harder than others. Although things in most of Minnesota aren't nearly as bad as many parts of the United States, there's no indication that we've seen the end or even the peak yet of this crisis. Recently released 2016 data show that drug overdose deaths in Minnesota are up nearly 500% since 2000, with more than half of the deaths due to opioids. How did we get into this mess as a country? The complex and multifactorial answer to that is outside the scope of this talk and my expertise, but I can think of no better and more readable resource than Sam Quinones' masterpiece, Dreamland. I can't recommend this book highly enough if you want to grasp how we got into this pickle. And many of you were probably on Mr. Quinones' webcast just a couple of weeks ago. So to understand why the intersection of the opioid epidemic and death investigation has produced what I call a perfect storm, we're going to switch gears for a minute and look at the history of death investigation in North America. The role of the coroner emerged in England in the 9th or 10th century and was formalized in the Articles of Eyre in 1194 under Richard I. Early coroners were also known as crowners or guardians of the Crown's pleas. These early coroners' role was to serve as a local official representing the Crown, as they had a duty to protect the financial interest of the Crown when someone died and their estate needed to be taxed. These early coroners were responsible for holding inquests to confirm the identity of the decedent, determine the cause and manner of death, and confiscate property and collect appropriate death duties for the king. Here in North America, the coroner was often established under common law, and the office of coroner was mentioned in some early state constitutions as a constitutional office. At the turn of the previous century, the coroner system in much of America was rife with corruption, and elected coroners were often used to balance a political ticket. For those of you interested in the history of forensic medicine, Deborah Bloom's masterpiece, The Poisoner's Handbook, chronicles death investigation in jazz-era New York City at this time in history. There's also a wonderful adaptation available on PBS. This is a photograph of New York City's first medical examiner featured in the book. On your right, Dr. Charles Norris, and some of the toxicologists on this call may recognize one of your founders, Alexander Gettler, there on the left of the photograph. Fast forward to 1954, when the National Conference of Commissioners of Uniform State Laws published a Model Postmortem Examinations Act and promulgated it to all of the states. The preamble of that act noted that experience has shown that many elected coroners are not well trained in the field of pathology, and the act should set up in each state an office headed by a trained pathologist who would have jurisdiction over postmortem examinations for criminal purposes. In the decades that followed 1954, many states did in fact adopt in some fashion parts of the Model Postmortem Examination Act. The act is now strikingly anachronistic because its emphasis is almost entirely on criminal cases, and it's really silent on things like tissue retention and disposition, tissue donation, exhumations, body storage, and the many other concerns of medical examiners and coroners in the modern era. I suspect everyone on this call is familiar with the groundbreaking 2009 National Academy of Sciences report on strengthening forensic science in the United States. There is a separate chapter in this report dealing specifically with death investigation, medical examiners, and coroners. And that chapter points out many of the deficiencies we have in our medical examiner coroner system, such as the patchwork system we have with wide variation in laws and policies and budgets, variations in expertise, facilities, access to equipment and laboratory support, all the way down to the fact that many of us do not have affiliations with bench researchers or universities. So where does this leave us in America today? Well, currently we have approximately 2,300 separate medical examiner and coroner offices in the United States. About 80% of these are county-based coroner systems. 660 of these serve populations of less than 250,000 people, and even more of these county-based systems serve populations of less than 25,000. This hodgepodge and multiplicity of systems and controlling statutes makes standards of performance in forensic pathology and death investigation very difficult. This multicolored map simply illustrates each state's way of handling death investigation systems. Some states have a statewide medical examiner system. Some states have a county-by-county coroner-based system. Many states have a hybrid of the two systems. I want to compare at a high level the difference between medical examiners and coroners. And for all intents and purposes, we're going to use the terms medical examiners and forensic pathologists interchangeably. To become a medical examiner or forensic pathologist in the United States requires a 4-year undergraduate degree, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency in pathology, an additional year of fellowship training in forensic pathology, a series of grueling board examinations, and the position is always an appointed one in state or local government. Contrast this with coroners in the United States. In many jurisdictions, the requirement to be a coroner is simply meeting a minimum age, being a registered voter, being free of felonies. Many coroners have variable medical training, if any. Many coroners have variable medical knowledge, if any, and the position of coroner is generally an elected position. Now, this is not true in all states. In Minnesota and Ohio, for example, those states require their coroners to be physicians, and they also have a provision for that coroner to be appointed rather than elected. So what sort of workforce numbers do we have for forensic pathologists in the United States? We only became a defined medical specialty with our first board examinations in 1959, and from that point until 2012, we produced a total of just under 1,500 forensic pathologists in the United States. Currently, there are about 500 of us practicing full-time, and even before the peak of the opioid epidemic was upon us, we needed 1,100 forensic pathologists in the United States just so every American could live in a district or a jurisdiction that was served by a forensic pathologist. Again, I'm going to put a great big asterisk by that number because that number predated the opioid fatalities we're seeing today. So what do medical examiners and coroners' offices do? Many people outside of our offices think that all we do is bring in bodies, perform autopsies, and sign death certificates. But in fact, there are many activities that take place in medical examiner and coroner offices. We identify bodies, we investigate deaths, we perform autopsies and certify those deaths, we manage a variety of laboratory services and records, we transport decedents, we often testify in court, we participate in our local and state disaster drills, we do community outreach and teaching, and many of us sit on a variety of fatality review teams such as domestic and elder and child abuse fatality reviews. We also investigate a wide variety of case types, including sudden unexpected natural deaths, stabbings and cuttings and shootings and falls and car crashes and strangulations and hangings. On the right side of this list, you'll see some things that medical examiners and coroners hope they never have to deal with, but we plan and drill for, such as transportation disasters, mass disasters, bombings, explosions, and the like. Many people in the general public think that all that medical examiners and coroners do is investigate murders because that's all they see on their evening news or read about in the newspapers. In fact, homicides are a very small percentage of our yearly caseload. This is a typical pie chart for my office over the course of the year. About 40% of the cases we end up certifying turn out to be natural deaths. These are relatively young people with little medical history whose deaths were unexplained until we performed the autopsy and found that blocked coronary artery or ruptured aneurysm or cancer that they were ignoring. About another 40% of our cases are non-motor vehicle accidents. In the past, the overwhelming majority of these cases were falls, particularly in the elderly. More and more of this 39% is being overtaken by unintended drug overdoses, as we'll see shortly. Homicides make up only about 4% of our caseload in any given year, and most people outside the medical examiner system are surprised to see that the suicide rate where they live is generally 2.5 or 3 times higher than the homicide rate where they live. So all of the deaths that we investigate get certified, and all of the data on those death certificates then get forwarded to our state departments of health. This just happens to be the website of the Minnesota Department of Health, where citizens can go and look at aggregate data and see how their fellow citizens died over the course of a year. And so you can see how many people died of cancer or heart diseases or accidents and a variety of other causes of death. But the data don't stop just there. State health departments then forward all their death certificate data to the National Center for Health Statistics, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control. And the NCHS and CDC then publish these data, and you as a citizen can go and see how your fellow Americans died in the preceding year. Now, the proper performance of autopsy, the accurate certification of deaths, then allows us at a national level to produce heat maps like this. This happens to be opioid overdose deaths per 100,000 people in 2015. And of course, the quality of this map and the quality of this data is only as good as what medical examiners and coroners and treating physicians are doing at the ground level in communities and in states across the country. I wish I could tell you that the burden of the opioid epidemic were the only challenge that we face in death investigation. But we actually have numerous challenges that we're looking at right now. I'm going to take these in two pairs, looking first at issues of certification and recruiting and retention of qualified practitioners in the field. These are numbers from the American Board of Pathology, which is the medical board that certifies forensic pathologists. And here is the number of first-time test takers and people who passed their board exams over the last 10 years. And you can see that on average, we are producing about 37 new forensic pathologists per year in the United States. That number is not nearly enough to keep up with the forensic pathologists who have died, who have retired, who have gotten burned out, or who have gone back to hospital practice. The projections from NIST and the former National Commission are actually even worse. This 2013 study predicted that after you account for forensic pathologists who leave the field or go into consulting or part-time practice, we're producing about 21 full-time forensic pathologists per year in the United States. And these numbers are the reason that you're seeing headlines like this in your state and local newspapers, because people are starting to appreciate that we have a real shortage of forensic pathologists across the country. This has even gotten the attention of national publications such as the Wall Street Journal, pointing out that a state shortage of forensic pathologists is delaying autopsies. The long-term projections don't look any better for the field. This is the College of American Pathologists long-term workforce projections published in 2013. The CAP looked at the number of pathologists predicted to be in the field from 2015 through the year 2030. And by the year 2030, we will have had such a steady decline in pathologists that we will have a deficit in excess of more than 5,700 full-time equivalent pathologists. Now keep in mind, forensic pathology is the trickle at the end of this evaporating stream. This is the pool of people from whom we hope to recruit enough forensic pathologists to populate America's medical examiner and coroner offices. Another barrier to recruiting and retaining forensic pathologists is the salary that we can offer, generally as public employees. These are 2014 median numbers for the cost, the debt incurred by medical students. And you can see that the median medical student in 2014 left medical school with $180,000 in debt. Now, most medical students, after they leave medical school, will go on to do a residency that's at least 3 years in length, during which time they really can't pay that debt down. They then amortize that debt over a 10-year period, and by the end of that 10-year period, the median practicing physician has incurred $328,000 in debt to finance their medical school education. That is a daunting amount of money, particularly when, as a graduating medical student, you're considering what specialty you would like to go into. Now, with no disrespect to my colleagues in orthopedic surgery, I just point this out as an example. Last year, the average salary to incentivize someone to join an orthopedic surgery practice was $579,000. That is for a specialty that has the same amount of school and the same number of years of residency training as a forensic pathologist. So when you look at that number and you consider the debt that the average medical student is incurring, you can see the current that my profession, forensic pathology, is swimming against when we try to recruit. The other challenges we have in forensic pathology, I think, center on issues of standards and accreditation. The National Association of Medical Examiners, or NAME, has forensic autopsy performance standards, and those standards mandate that all apparent drug-related deaths require an investigation and an autopsy, the exception being those unusual circumstances where someone is hospitalized long enough that we have all of their medical findings and we have the appropriate specimens. NAME also has a very robust inspection and accreditation checklist used to accredit medical examiner and coroner offices. So we might ask, why aren't all medical examiner and coroner offices accredited? Of the 2,300 offices across the country that I mentioned earlier, currently 89 are fully accredited by the National Association of Medical Examiners. The good news is that number represents about half of the country being served by an accredited medical examiner or coroner office. Although, as we'll see very shortly, the opioid crisis threatens the accreditation of many of these offices. Smaller coroner offices may never be able to achieve accreditation because of their size, their lack of staff, or the fact that they don't even have a physical facility. Even larger medical examiner offices are often constrained by issues of budget, staff, equipment, or the quality and size of their facility. Accreditation is a lot of work. The process requires renewal. The process costs money, and some offices do not see the benefit of being accredited. NAME positions include that laboratory accreditation should be mandatory. Individual practitioners in the forensic sciences should be certified in their specialty, and that includes forensic pathology and medical examiners. And NAME has also stated that all medical legal autopsies should be performed or directly supervised by a board-certified forensic pathologist. I'm going to take that same asterisk from a few slides ago because clearly the shortage we have of practicing forensic pathologists makes this last statement aspirational at best. So circling back, what does any of this have to do with the opioid epidemic? This is where we get the perfect storm, because we're trying to cope with this opioid epidemic with this workforce. Again, before the opioid epidemic even started the ascent to what we're seeing today, we needed 1,100 forensic pathologists in the United States, and I haven't even calculated the numbers to try to figure out how many we would need today just to deal with the caseload in our offices across the country. But this is swamping medical examiner and coroner offices, and that's why you're seeing headlines like this from all over the country, and headlines like this from all over the country. As the current president of the National Association of Medical Examiners has noted, the sheer number of cases is threatening office accreditation across the country. That's Dr. Brian Peterson, my friend and colleague over in Wisconsin. Dr. Peterson also has gone on to say inadequate numbers, expected retirements, and increased caseloads have truly combined to become the perfect storm, hat tip to Dr. Peterson, of our time. The situation in forensic pathology is truly dire. And again, some places are certainly getting hit harder than others. More than 4,700 people in Ohio died from unintentional drug overdoses in 2016, a 36% leap from just the previous year when Ohio was already leading the nation in fatal overdoses. An average of 11 people died every day in 2016 in Ohio from heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil, or other drugs. These preliminary 2017 data for just 6 counties in Ohio show the problem getting much worse. Some coroners may even be undercounting opioid deaths, given the lack of funding and the lack of staff. Some of the largest and most respected medical examiner offices in the country are also under unprecedented stress, given the magnitude of the epidemic in the jurisdiction in which they serve. Consider that this graph is just fentanyl deaths for one state for the first 3 quarters of each year through last year. Notice the jump from 2015 to 2016 for just fentanyl. That 2016 number alone is 3 full-time equivalent assistant medical examiner workloads for an entire year. And the headlines just keep coming and coming. And this is not a problem just for inner cities and large population centers. The opioid epidemic is taxing all levels of the death investigation system in America. So how do coroners and medical examiners go about investigating what appear to be opioid-related deaths? NAME, the National Association of Medical Examiners, in conjunction with the American College of Medical Toxicology, published a position paper to answer that very question. The first component of any opioid death investigation or any potential drug death is a complete scene investigation that extends to reconciliation of prescription information and pill counts from the scene. Now, certainly for some, but not all, of the opioid-related deaths that death investigators go to, there's evidence of opioid use, as you can see from the drug paraphernalia from this particular scene photograph. Here is another scene from a fatal opioid overdose. As this decedent was being rolled onto the bed you see in the photograph by first responders, the drug paraphernalia that was under his body becomes evident. Here is another decedent, a young woman, slumped over, found dead, and on the floor next to her is the telltale drug paraphernalia, your first clue that you may be dealing with an opioid-related fatality. One of the more typical findings seen by death investigators at scenes is this foam cone of frothy edema fluid coming out of the nose and mouth. Here's another opiate fatality where the victim appears to have just slumped to the ground. The foam cone coming from his nose and mouth is so pronounced that it is even soaked through his shirt and into the carpeting underneath him. So a solid scene investigation is the first component of addressing an apparent opioid fatality. The second component is a complete autopsy, which NAME states is necessary for optimal interpretation of the results, which must be considered in the context of the circumstances of death, the medical history, and the scene findings. Like the scene findings, there are things at the autopsy table that are certainly suggestive of, but not diagnostic of, an opioid fatality. These would include the fresh-appearing needle punctures that you see here, or here's another example illustrating both acute and recent needle punctures, and sometimes we see the scars from older injection sites. In some decedents, the needle punctures can be very subtle, so the pathologist may need to incise and dissect apparent injection sites, which can be helpful in determining that an injection site is really present. And of course, not all injection sites are in the typical locations in the antecubital fossa of the arms or on the forearms or the back of the hands, as you can see from this injection site discovered over the ankle of a decedent. The foam cone that is seen by investigators at the death scene often persists in the body bag through the hours or even overnight until the autopsy commences. This foam cone can even continue to develop and grow during body transport and storage, again, all of this taking place prior to the autopsy. This foam cone is the external manifestation of the frothy edema fluid that's filling the decedent's lungs and their tracheobronchial tree. Descriptions of this finding actually date to Osler in 1880, although the precise mechanism for this edema filling the tracheobronchial tree remains unknown. At the autopsy table, pulmonary edema is the most common autopsy finding in opioid overdoses. Other findings sometimes seen include a distended urinary bladder or swelling of the brain. Again, all of these findings are nonspecific. They certainly suggest an opioid fatality, but they are not diagnostic. The next component of investigating any potential opioid-related death is, of course, toxicological testing. NAME recommends a comprehensive panel that includes not only opioids, but other potential depressants and stimulants. This is a typical example of what I get back from my toxicology laboratory here in Minneapolis. This particular decedent screened positive for amphetamine and opiates by immunoassay, confirmed as morphine and methamphetamine on GCMS. 6-MAM, 6-monoacetylmorphine, the metabolite diagnostic of heroin use, is also present. It's worth noting that this autopsy took place some 3 weeks before the screening results were reported. When you add another 3 weeks for the quantitative testing, and you have a family waiting a month and a half or more for answers and a death certificate. As the opioid numbers continue to grow, our turnaround times for laboratory reports, death certificates, and autopsy reports continue to get longer. Finally, any toxicological results must be interpreted in the context of the medical history, the scene findings, and the autopsy findings if they're going to make any sense. I would submit to you that we see a spectrum of cases among our opioid fatalities. At one end of the spectrum, we have what I call the easy cases, and they're easy in the sense that these victims are generally younger. The drug paraphernalia is obvious at the scene. The toxicology results come back with things that they should never have had in their system, such as heroin or fentanyl analogs. The person is on no prescriptions for opiates, and there are no competing disease processes that we have to factor in to try to figure out why this individual died. Many, many, many of our opioid fatalities fall into this particular description. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the cases that are much harder. These tend to be older decedents who have lots of prescription medications, including opioids, at the scene of death. Their toxicology results generally show the expected types of opioids in their systems that one would predict based on their prescriptions and their medical history, and they also have many competing disease processes that may explain why they died. And so what makes these hard cases hard? Well, we as the medical examiners have to figure out what is the interaction of this person's natural diseases and the drugs that we found in their system, because the ultimate question is, did they actually die from the drugs or simply with the drugs in their system but actually died of their natural diseases? We need to reconcile their medications with the scene findings. We are always grappling with the issue of post-mortem redistribution because I think we could all agree that the number you get back from the lab in a post-mortem tube of blood does not automatically equate to what that person's blood level would have been had you drawn the blood when they were alive. Compounding that problem is we really have no great ranges for what is a quote-unquote normal opiate level in post-mortem blood and what is an unequivocally fatal level in post-mortem blood. And there's no way from the autopsy table we can assess how tolerant a person is to opiates. And so for all of these reasons, some of our opioid-related fatalities or apparent opioid-related fatalities can be very hard to parse out and certify properly. I would hope that most medical examiners and coroners have been given access to their state's prescription monitoring program, as we have here in Minnesota. This is an incredibly powerful tool for finding out what a decedent has been scripted and for how long, and can be very helpful in reconciling scene findings, pill counts, and toxicology results. Now, on top of all of this, I would also point out that not every drug death is necessarily a result of the direct toxicity of that drug. Here, for example, is a postmortem chest radiograph of a young man who was found dead at home. You can see on the chest radiograph that he has an indwelling central venous catheter for the long-term management of his various medical conditions. His lungs also look very unusual on this radiograph because they're not clear and filled with air. They have sort of a ground glass opacity to them. At autopsy, when you look at his lungs on close inspection, you see innumerable white nodules that give the lungs the gross consistency of sandpaper. Microscopically, his pulmonary vasculature is clogged with foreign material that you can see here at the tips of the yellow arrows. And with a technique pathologists use called polarized microscopy, that material lights up quite brilliantly, telling you that that material is foreign. This material, which invokes a striking, progressive, destructive reaction in the lungs, is the various excipients used in oral pain medications. Some opioid addicts grind up their pills and tablets and inject them intravenously. The lungs bear the brunt of this damage from the insoluble components of the medications. A less common complication of intravenous drug use in the modern era, but still sometimes found at autopsy, is bacterial endocarditis. These infected clots on the heart valves of these IV drug users can embolize to other vital organs, resulting in sepsis, myocardial infarcts, and fatal strokes. Hepatitis C and resulting cirrhosis remain a problem for intravenous drug users. Here's an unusual case in which we found multiple areas of necrosis in the brain of this intravenous drug user. These areas of necrosis turn out to be microabscesses scattered throughout this man's brain. This man acquired HIV, completely undiagnosed until autopsy, from his intravenous opiate use. And the microabscesses in his brain turned out to be toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that rarely causes any serious disease in immunocompetent individuals, but can be deadly in untreated HIV. So getting back to the opioid epidemic, our heroin deaths have skyrocketed the last several years. What are some of the reasons for that? What's going on with heroin is that it's gotten cheaper and much more pure because so many people have gotten addicted to opiates through medical channels. They are now moving off those pharmaceutical opiates to fentanyl. And beginning several years ago, we started to see our heroin adulterated with and then completely replaced by fentanyl. And that's why you see newspaper articles like this all over the country linking thousands of deaths to fentanyl. So sometimes our heroin was getting contaminated with fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. And then late last year, and in the case of Minnesota earlier this year, we had a new kid on the block, and that turned out to be yet another fentanyl analog known as carfentanil. Now, I believe this was seen in Ohio and a few other places as early as 2016. We had an outbreak of 11 cases in Minneapolis earlier this year. Carfentanil is very problematic for a number of reasons. It's reported to be 10,000 times as potent as morphine and 100 times as potent as fentanyl. Carfentanil has never been tested in or approved for use by humans. It is only approved use, so far as I know, is as a large animal tranquilizer, and it can be potentially hazardous to first responders and law enforcement if they were to handle the drug improperly at a scene. For us in the medical examiner world, the big problems with carfentanil are that it's not picked up on most of our routine drug screens, and so many medical examiners' offices, including mine, rely on a reference laboratory to do the send-out testing for us. Not surprisingly, this is expensive, and this additional testing takes time. And it's not just carfentanil anymore. At the top of this screen, you can see the fentanyl molecule. At the bottom of this screen, these are just some of the fentanyl analogs that are being found in postmortem specimens. In the last month or two, we just had this started popping up, yet another fentanyl analog, cyclopropyl fentanyl. It is absolutely imperative that medical examiners and forensic pathologists are routinely communicating with their toxicologists and their toxicology labs so that we know what their capabilities are, we know what they can see, and they know the sorts of things that we are looking for. The opioid crisis has gotten so bad that the National Association of Medical Examiners earlier this year even dedicated an entire issue just to the opioid crisis. Yet another challenge to the forensic pathologist is the fact that more and more opioid-related deaths are now being prosecuted. This brings many added layers of complexity for us, ranging from chain of custody to the time and preparation required for courtroom testimony. So just to recap what I covered in the last 45 minutes, we touched on the scope of the opioid epidemic in America, talked about how we got to where we are today, how we investigate deaths in America, some current challenges to death investigation that came together to create this perfect storm where these opioid deaths are being piled onto a system that was already taxed beyond capacity. And we talked a little bit about how we investigate opioid-related deaths. Just a couple of concluding thoughts, and then I very much look forward to questions and feedback. It's certainly no longer hyperbole to call this a crisis or an epidemic. The pace of the epidemic is outpacing the ability of the medical examiner and coroner system to keep up. I don't have any solutions to the second bullet point on this slide. In a perfect world, obviously we wouldn't have an opioid epidemic and we wouldn't be having this discussion. But short of that, we need more practitioners in the field to handle the caseload, and if I had a magic wand, I would certainly make faster, cheaper, more comprehensive toxicology testing available. And I certainly know my toxicology colleagues out there are working night and day to come up with the assays and screens we need to find this burgeoning problem with these fentanyl analogs. So with that, I would be happy to take questions, Josh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. We're going to go ahead and switch everyone's layout now to our Q&A layout. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, so we'll just jump right into it. The first one is from Sylvia Martinez, and she's asking, how often do the, as you mentioned, quote-unquote, new kids on the block show up?
It feels like it's about every month to every other month right now, at least here in the Midwest. We have a little bit of advantage over my colleagues on the East Coast because these things seem to have been coming in waves that are migrating westward, and so we were already aware of things like carfentanil popping up in Ohio last year, which tipped us off that we needed to do some testing for it here when we had these obvious drug deaths where our lab couldn't see anything. So again, to answer the question, it feels like about every month to every other month. And again, I can't emphasize enough that you've got to be in constant communication with your toxicology lab if you're a practicing medical examiner, so you know what they can see and what they can't see.
All right. Next question we have is from Margaret Warner. She's asking, or she's requesting, it would be helpful to have Dr. Baker discuss investigation of drug overdose death for the manner of death.
So the standard, and this is also in the name position paper that I presented during the formal part of this presentation, the standard for manner of death on the majority of these cases is they're certified as accidents. If you have good reasons to believe the death is a suicide based on the scene investigation, the history, obviously if the person left a note, then you would properly certify them as suicides, but that's really the majority, the minority. The overwhelming number of these cases are certified as accidents. And I should emphasize that the manner of death is simply the medical examiner's opinion for public health purposes as to how that death certificate should be classified. It's not a legal classification, and the medical examiner's classification should have no bearing on whether police investigate case or prosecutors decide to take a case to court.
All right. Next question we have is from Cinda Edwards. She's asking, does Minnesota allow the ME office direct computer access to prescription monitoring? She states in Illinois we are required to request info and it may take a week to receive. I'm advocating for computer real-time access.
You should absolutely be advocating for computer real-time access. So all medical examiners and coroner have real-time access to our prescription monitoring database. I can get to it from any internet-enabled computer I have access to. I can also delegate that ability to my investigators. So even in the middle of the night, when they've brought a body in, they may go ahead and access that person's prescription monitoring program data, not only to find out what they were prescribed and how much, but sometimes it's our best clue as to who this person's treating physician was, so we can even get the ball rolling on investigation. But I would definitely say your office will do better death investigations if you can get those data in real time.
All right. Next question we have, do you have any sense of how these drugs, such as carfentanil, are making it onto the streets or into the hands of those suffering addiction?
I don't. That's really outside the scope of my area of expertise. I've certainly picked up some things from the DEA agents that I work with, because when we recognized we had carfentanil in our cases here, I immediately alerted the DEA. I'm told that it's coming in through China. I'm not sure that the street-level dealers even know what they're dealing, by the time it's gone through so many hands before it's out there on the streets. Clearly, I don't think any of our decedents had any idea that it was actually carfentanil when they were being told they were, given heroin or regular fentanyl.
And this next question might be a little outside the scope as well. We can judge it more as an opinion question. Why do you feel that dealers would be adding carfentanil to heroin if it will kill their customers and clientele that much more easier?
Again, that's outside my area of expertise. I usually punt questions like that to the DEA.
All right, this one will be more in line with your expertise. I've been hearing about the lack of students pursuing for path as a medical career. What is being done to recruit these students for forensic pathology? I've heard of no scholarships, paid fellowships, or tuition forgiveness programs.
So, yeah, there's a lot of ways to address that question. Of course, we as forensic pathologists love to engage our local medical schools, give lectures to forensic science interest groups, even at the undergrad level. In my office here, my physicians actually go out into local high schools and guest teach their forensic science classes. It's usually like part of an AP biology program. So we get people introduced to the field early. The worse the epidemic gets and the more taxed our workforce is, of course, the harder it is for us to do those extracurriculars, like get across town to the university or go to a high school and give one of these presentations. In terms of financially getting more people to go into the field, medical examiners have certainly talked about things like loan forgiveness, since we're clearly an underserved specialty. To my knowledge, the office in Phoenix, and this is news as only a couple of weeks ago, was starting to offer some loan forgiveness, and that's a first in the field of forensic pathology. So that may be somewhat helpful in recruiting people. My own gut feeling is until forensic pathology salary and benefits are on par with what general pathologists and other people with a similar level of training are getting, we're just going to continue this swimming against the stream.
All right. Next question we have looks like a two-parter from Demi Garvin. What steps are being taken to educate and improve the way in which death certificates are signed? Has there been any position statement put forward to delineate the specific naming of each drug believed to be involved in that death?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, NAME has certainly put out publications about optimal death certification, as has the Centers for Disease Control. I'm not aware of very many medical schools that offer any instructions whatsoever in death certification. I certainly never had any as a medical student. Most of us out in the field as practicing forensic pathologists routinely go to our larger local hospitals, our level 1 trauma centers every few years and give a grand rounds or a continuing education on not only what does the medical examiner's office do, but what can you as a clinician do to recognize cases that have to be reported to us so that you don't accidentally certify a heroin toxicity as a pneumonia and completely botch that particular death certificate. So that's one of the things we do. And then there was a second part of that question, which is what have we done to get people to name the drugs on death certificates? NAME, again, has put out an official position statement that the ideal death certificate, if it's a drug overdose, lists every drug the pathologist thought contributed to that person's death. I'm not sure if there's some state health departments that if they were to get a death certificate that just said drug overdose, if they would loop back to the certifier and say we need more information. But again, as of last year, about 17% of death certificates in America did not specify what the drugs were.
All right, next question we have is, with so many fentanyl analogs identified and related to fatal overdoses, how do you capture all of these analogs through toxicological testing? Have you seen a single drug that caused a fatal overdose versus the analogs?
Yeah, so to answer that, the first part of that question, with these fentanyl analogs seeming to proliferate on an almost weekly or monthly basis, in my office here, for example, we have a weekly meeting with our entire toxicology lab staff where we talk about all of our pending tox cases. We discuss what's new. We also have our poison control center and our emergency room physicians attend to that multidisciplinary conference. And so we get everyone's collective input because I get to learn what first responders are seeing on the street, what the call center at the poison control center is hearing about, and what they're seeing in the emergency rooms. And then my lab can let me know, what are our capabilities, what can we see, and what can't we see. And the reference lab that I use, that my office uses, is great about fielding phone calls from us and answering those questions as well. For the second part of that question, have we seen a deaths solely from fentanyl analogs? The answer to that is yes. Several of those carfentanil cases that I talked about, our 11 death outbreak here in Minnesota, several of those were purely carfentanil. There were no other discernible drugs or alcohol or prescription medications in those people's systems. We actually get a level back from the lab when they detect fentanyl, but again, since the drug's really never been tested or approved for use in humans, we don't really know what those levels mean. We don't know what the drug is doing, pharmacologically or pharmacokinetically in people's bodies. And we also know from a few people that have been arrested for driving under the influence who had carfentanil in their blood that the levels appear to overlap with decedents.
All right, next question we have, and just before we move on to this question, I just want to point out that Dr. Baker's contact email is down there at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have any follow-up questions after the webinar that might come to mind, be sure to go ahead and take that down so you can respond to him directly. So the next question we have is from Elizabeth Bilden, and she asks, how easy or difficult is it to document heroin death if you need to document 6-ma'am rather than just morphine presence, i.e. is it common to find 6-ma'am in most cases suspected to be heroin toxicity?
So in my experience, most of our suspected heroin cases, we do end up finding 6-ma'am one way or the other. Most of the time we see the 6-ma'am in the urine and we have quantifiable morphine in the blood, and that is adequate for certifying the death as heroin toxicity. We have good luck doing this, and I don't have the citations handy, but I know it's been published, but you can also look for 6-ma'am in vitreous fluid, which is a great place to find it even in low levels, and then when the lab confirms that, the person's had a heroin exposure. If you have a death scene where there's drug paraphernalia present, the tourniquet's laying next to the arm and you got the syringes on the floor under the body, if you've exhausted all your normal ways of finding 6-ma'am in the body, we have had our lab also test the syringes, and they can find not only the 6-ma'am but even the parent diacetyl morphine in the syringe. It's uncommon for us to have a case that seems obviously heroin and never find the 6-ma'am anywhere. but it does sometimes happen. But we feel it's important enough to prove that it's heroin that we will, send the vitreous up to the lab and have them look for it if the routine screen on the blood or the urine didn't see it. Because as you know, I'm sure from asking the question, that the half-life of 6-mAm in blood is not very long.
All right. Next question we have is from Amy Wild. She's asking what is being done on a national level to address the deficiencies the 2009 NAS report identified.
With regard to medical examiner and coroner systems, the answer to that really is not much. There's no incentives out there at the federal level that I'm aware of for states to beef up their medical examiner and coroner laws. If there's a large pot of money out there available to medical examiners and coroners to hire and train the people they need or to expand their outdated facilities, I'm unaware of it. I can tell you that NAME certainly has lobbied very hard for many things at the federal level. We haven't gotten a lot of traction to date, but we're certainly working at it. NAME has a seat on the Consortium of Forensic Science Organizations, a group that represents the AAFS and ASCLD and SOFT and a few other organizations. So we certainly do have a way to get to our elected leaders in Washington, D.C., but we haven't really seen much action. We did get some really great results from the NCFS when it still existed. To me, one of the most important ones was that the NCFS ratified the idea that we needed a brand new Model Medical Examiner Act. That 1954 one that I talked about that's so antiquated. I believe NAME feels very strongly that a new model act should be developed and should be made available to all the states to adopt as appropriate. But again, I don't know how far we've gotten with that, but it was nice that NCFS recommended it.
All right. The next question we have is from Cinda Edwards again. She's asking, are hospitals allow our office access to the EMR? This is very helpful. Do you think this is very common for hospitals to allow access to this report?
That is great that you have access to your hospital's EMR. I don't know how common that is. In my office here, for example, I serve 3 counties, about 1.7 million people. There's probably 10 or 12 hospitals in my jurisdiction. None of them currently provide us access to their EMR, but inexplicably, they will immediately print off all the records we need, stick them on a fax machine, and fax them to my office. So we at least get them, although they're not native digital PDFs that are easy to read and search. So we sort of have real-time access. I've been working with hospitals to try to get us real-time access. But as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of IT departments, particularly in healthcare, are very risk averse, and so setting up the appropriate protections for those data has not been easy. But it would be great if medical examiners and coroners could get real-time, access to those digital records to get rolling on these death investigations.
All right, we've got a few more questions I think we have time for. We'll squeeze in. So the next one is from John Soper asking, what is your typical turnaround time for an opiate diagnosis?
I would say in my office here, our typical turnaround time is now getting up into the 4 to 6 week range, which I realize is actually pretty good compared to what a lot of my peers around the country are getting. But it wasn't that long ago that we were turning them around in half that much time. But again, we're backlogged with cases, the lab is backlogged, we're backlogged with autopsy reports. I would say the typical case is 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if we're chasing an opiate and after all that time we still don't find anything, and then we have to turn around and send a specimen to a reference lab because we've exhausted the fentanyl and the heroin and the oxycodone and we can't find any, now we're chasing the carfentanyls and the cyclopropylfentanyls and the new analogs, and so you can add more time to the case for that as well.
All right, next question we have is from Tiffany. She's asking, why, other than the lack of finances, are more states not turning to the ME system rather than sticking with the antiquated coroner system? In Nebraska, we have the coroner system, but right across the border in Iowa is a state-of-the-art forensic pathology lab. It's amazing to me that states do not happen to move quicker to make this happen. And she states that she stopped at her master's degree in criminal justice due to the lack of opportunities in her state.
That's a great question. So, the lack of finances is obviously the biggest one. For a lot of states, death investigation isn't necessarily a priority until something high profile goes very, very bad and your state newspaper, and your TV stations are all over you, and that tends to get people's attention. Otherwise, dead people don't get a lot of attention. Um, Keep in mind that in some states, the coroner system is not just embedded in state law, it may actually be a constitutional office. And so to convert from a coroner to a medical examiner system might not just be an act of the legislature, it might take a constitutional amendment, which takes a lot of momentum to get past that. And then keep in mind, given the shortage of forensic pathologists we have, even if we somehow could create all the medical examiner offices across the country we needed, we wouldn't have the people to staff them. So I think there's a number of reasons why the momentum to create more medical examiners' offices really stalled out in the late 70s, early 80s after that wave of conversions following the 1954 law.
All right, and our last question, when we receive the reports of an opioid overdose that is classified by the coroner as quote-unquote accidental and not clearly shown to be an opioid, even though the evidence supports it, how do you suggest we address the discrepancies by the coroner?
Um, that's an interesting circumstance. It would help if I knew more of the context of the question, because I'm not sure how a death gets classified as an opioid toxicity, even though it's not clear. Again, I guess to answer the question, go look at the name paper that I cited in this presentation, the name position paper published in 2013, because it lists exactly the criteria that name fields need to be present to certify a case as being opioid related. And of course, those various criteria would include the solid scene investigation, the appropriate medical history, the performance of a complete autopsy, because you have to rule out that the person actually died of a natural condition or something else and the opioids are incidental. And then, of course, you have to have the appropriate tox testing to support that. And that tox testing needs to be comprehensive and confirmatory, not just a simple screen for 5 or 6 or 7 drugs, but you've got to include the antidepressants, other prescription medications, and other things with depressive side effects like benzos and alcohol.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Baker. Before we do move on, again, go ahead and take Dr. Baker's email address down there at the bottom of your screen. And we would like to ask you, Dr. Baker, if you have any closing words or anything that you would like to put out to our audience from your perspective.
Well, most importantly, I just appreciate the opportunity to address what I think is a very diverse audience, particularly folks who may not be working with medical examiners and coroners all the time. Thank you for listening to our part of this very difficult problem, and to the toxicologists that I think are probably on this call. I can't thank you enough for all the great work you're doing to try to help us keep up and make sure that we don't miss any cases.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Baker. We are going to go ahead and move into our closing for the day. You've got quite a few thank yous coming in from our audience. The first thing we would like to do, obviously, is to thank Dr. Andrew Baker for his time in delivering his presentation today. We definitely appreciate him taking the time out of his obviously busy schedule to speak to our audience today. We would also like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. These webinars would definitely not be possible without your attendance and your support for not just this webinar, but the opioid epidemic as a whole. Before you do leave today's webinar, we would like to ask you to participate in our short survey. You'll find it there in the middle of your screen. If you simply click the word "here," it will take you to a new link where you can access our survey. We do like to find out your webinar experience and just the content and the way we disseminate the information to you, our audience. So if you would take a few moments to complete that before you leave, we do appreciate that. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you will find a PDF version of Dr. Baker's slides. So we want to make sure that you, the audience, have access to that before you do leave today. So if you click on the title of that file and then click the download file button at the bottom of the screen, you will be able to download that PDF directly from the room before you leave today. Again, we do want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We have recorded this webinar. It will be available as our archival version in the next few days. Be sure to check out our website at www.forensiccoe.org to find our complete course list as well as all of the archival versions for this opioid series. Again, thank you so much for participating with us today. Thank you very much, Dr. Baker, for your time, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon.